Alright, I'm going to do the obvious reference once. Bell, let's talk. Every year in late January since 2011, people across the country of Canada have been subjected to the same messaging. For every text message, call, or hashtag Bell Let's Talk sent, Bell Canada will donate 5 cents to mental health initiatives across the country. The impact is not insignificant, and not counting 2022, which I'm sure will have millions more messages and dollars donated by Bell, there have been over 1.3 billion interactions gone towards the campaign. Now, has mental health discourse improved because of this initiative? Well, according to Bell, it has. They report that 4 in 5 Canadians are now more willing to talk about mental health issues since the campaign began in the early 2010s. But this isn't the full story, is it? Canada has been grappling with a mental illness crisis that has only gotten worse during the COVID-19 pandemic and the government response. According to the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health, 1 in 5 Canadians currently struggles with mental illness. And by the time they're 40, 1 in 2 Canadians will have or have had a mental illness. Now, this was all reported before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, it's gotten dramatically worse. But Bell's not to blame for that. Are they? The criticisms of Bell Let's Talk are numerous, and we're going to go through most of them to build a larger framework of the issue of Bell tackling mental health. Take a look at the ads that Bell puts out, and you'll see a very key distinction. While there does seem to be an effort to not exclusively feature white people, it's clear that some mental illnesses are shown the spotlight, while others are excluded. In an editorial, the Fulcrum points out that while the ads Bell puts out showcases struggles with anxiety, depression, OCD, and PTSD, there's no mention of mental illnesses like addiction, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or dissociative identity disorder. Including every mental illness is, of course, an unreasonable aim, but the ones that they do choose to highlight are ones that are closer to mainstream acceptance. The Fulcrum challenges us to imagine a Bell Let's Talk spot from a heroin addict discussing the horrible feelings of withdrawal, or someone discussing how it feels to crawl out of your own skin in a hallucination because of schizophrenia. Let's remember, first and foremost, Bell Let's Talk is a PR campaign, so to portray the way that these people with these taboo mental illnesses are treated by society ruins the squeaky clean brand that Bell is trying to build around this mental health. And let's face it, it doesn't address the systemic inequality that makes these conditions worse. This systemic inequality is, by necessity, excluded from the campaign itself. By some reports, Indigenous people in Canada are 6 to 11 times more likely to die by suicide. A systemic analysis of this issue is distinctly lacking from Bell's focus. Bell has attempted to address these concerns in recent years. They've announced that they're going to donate more to Indigenous organizations, and they even launched a podcast to help with mental health for BIPOC people. However, it's notable that the podcast was only launched in October 2021 after a notorious year of uncovering children's bodies buried on residential school grounds. 10 years after the campaign's original launch, and this national disgrace of genocide brought to the spotlight, Bell finally addresses the issue. The podcast does have an episode on intergenerational trauma suffered by Indigenous communities, and I won't lie, it was a powerful listen. But regarding its intent, First Nations Chief Edmund Metatawabin asks the audience and the interviewers about what they hope to gain from hearing his traumatic experience.
So this is not yesterday's experience. This is today that we're talking about. And I don't really understand why you want to hear all this stuff that happened to us. What are you going to do with it? And you're going to walk away and talk about it? You're going to go to the bar and talk about it? I don't know what you're going to do with it. But by asking me to talk about these things, I don't know what the end result will be on your part. But me, I am trying to get out of it. I'm trying to resolve it. I'm trying to sort of find a sense of balance, a sense of being, a sense of being a personality, a person that does things.
The hosts do their best to respond to this. Jamar says that he sees the Queen's face on a $20 bill and says that the Crown has a role to play. And then they ask the question, who's responsible? They also rightfully point the finger at the government for St. Anne's residential school survivors in court. And then they ask, where do we as a society go from here? Where can we go from here? This analysis is warranted, but its lack of scope becomes concerning when you look at the history. Bell, as a company, has existed in one form or another since 1880, 3 years before the first residential school opened. While Bell was not the mega corporation that it is today, it was the head of over 80 companies before consolidation in 1983. The Canadian Encyclopedia points out that Bell Canada, the parent company, was the largest telephone provider in the country at that point. This means that while there is no evidence that I could find to directly relate to this, there is a strong chance that any telephones that were operated and serviced in residential schools were done so by Bell or one of its subsidiaries. Now, let's be charitable here and assume that Bell has had no relation to the genocidal residential school system. Like I said, I don't have any concrete evidence of this. Why did it take them 10 years into their mental health campaign to specifically address Indigenous communities and intergenerational trauma in a way that isn't entirely comprehensive? The lack of systemic criticism by this company becomes more concerning the longer the podcast goes on. After the first interview, they bring on another residential school survivor and ask her about her traumatic experiences. And this is right after Chief Metatawabin questioned why people need to hear these stories. Now, I don't want to get down on any of these hosts, one of whom is Mi'kmaq. They do a fantastic job of confronting these hard topics. I merely want to point out the limitations of a corporate discussion of mental health, a corporation that will ultimately prioritize certain narratives over others. I also don't mean to focus directly on racism against Indigenous people at the expense of other people of color in this country. Canada has been racist since its colonial inception, and it expresses itself in different ways against different groups. Almost 66% of Black Canadians have reported feeling depression as a direct result of racial discrimination. And on a national level, Canadians have yet to truly reckon with our anti-Black racism. This racism is built into the foundation of our country. I didn't even know that Canada had slaves until about 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't see an institutional discussion about the topic, let alone a reckoning with it. This Canadian anti-Black racism leads to an increased risk of mental health problems, undeniably because of the systemic issues and barriers put up by the Canadian capitalist system. These biases aren't only in personal interactions either. We've seen the rise of discussing medical racism in this country over the past year or so, and that discussion has been almost entirely absent from Bell's mental health initiatives. As such, Bell favors individual actions and a vague change in approach when they talk about mental health issues. I'm not going to go through all the organizations that Bell chooses to donate to and try and pick apart if they're good or not. I'm sure these orgs and all the people who work for them have helped Canadians in ways that I could not possibly imagine. And if there are issues with some of these orgs, that's outside the scope of this video. I'm focusing on Bell's campaign. What I will do is focus on Bell, the company's actions that directly impacts the mental health of Canadians. There are stories that have been made public by employees of Bell who have been put under immense pressure by the company to reach sales targets. There are stories of people losing 40 pounds or puking blood from stress, having anxiety attacks, and receiving 3 a.m. phone calls from managers about sales targets have been reported. Even a Bell employee remarked that doctors were well aware of the Bell effect, where doctors immediately prescribe leave to Bell employees upon learning about their employer. In addition, a Bell Media radio host told reporters that she was fired directly because of a mental health leave she was prescribed to take by her doctor. She said that her boss suggested she take over the morning show one day, and the next day, after showing a doctor's note prescribing time off, she was fired. Bell said that they unequivocally do not fire people because of mental health reasons, but the host says she was never given a reason for her firing. Speaking of firing, Bell Media is almost notorious for rounds of layoffs that take place in November, right before the holiday season and before the Canadian winter gets to its worst. They've done this in 2015, 2017, 2019, 2020, and 2021. Bell's treatment of its staff is also not the only negative impact it's had on Canadians either. Bell has an exclusive contract with provincial jails to provide calling, and it isn't free. Bell charges $1 for local calls and up to $30 for long-distance calls from prisoners in provincial jails. These are the only channels that prisoners can use to contact someone, as landline telephones are the only methods allowed. Bell directly profits from the Canadian prison system, which, needless to say, is destructive in all fashion, including mental health. Let's start at the beginning. And by beginning, I mean literally the first word of the initiative. Bell, let's talk. It's not let's talk or open discussion or destigmatize. It's Bell, let's talk. While the decision to put the company's name at the beginning of a company's campaign makes sense, Let's Talk is also an extension of Bell itself, referring to the services that the company provides. As Emily Jackson wrote in the Financial Post, They had a debate about whether to call it Bell Let's Talk or simply Let's Talk, but decided to use the Bell brand to combat the stigma around mental health issues. Besides, the Let's Talk aspect fit the company's core business of telephone, wireless, and internet connections. But this has implications beyond using the Bell brand to combat stigma, a brand that most Canadians probably have disdain for anyway. Jasmine Vito, in her paper A Critical Investigation of Bell Let's Talk from the University of Windsor, delved into the campaign and its effects. Regarding the branding of the name, she wrote, "If Bell truly wanted to promote mental health rather than their company, the more companies involved, the better. Instead, Bell is incorporating positive mental health, a very brandable topic and one that works well with their target segment of younger people, with their advertising campaign to encourage Canadians to be activists." And that marketability of the brand is very important in the Let's Talk campaign. How much does it cost to promote on social media? Well, it depends what you're looking for. We can't usually assume, for example, that one tweet costs blank, because that's not really how social media advertising works. If you're to promote your brand on Twitter, then you would have parameters and you would spend amount of money between those parameters, and that would determine the reach and the effectiveness. The amount of posts this generates and their reach varies as a result of this, but we can use some averages to get a good idea of the amount of money that would be needed to spend to get the reach that Bell does on Let's Talk Day. For example, let's take a look at Twitter and do our best to break down the cost of advertising on the platform. For individual tweets, this marketing firm says it can cost between 50 cents and $2, citing that the average is around $1.35. Meanwhile, a trending topic can sell for $200,000. The baseline this sets is telling. We don't have the information specifically for how many tweets were posted with Bell's hashtag, as I could only find the total number of social media interactions. Social media engagement, hashtags, filters, frames, and video views on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Snapchat, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube reached 42,688,092 interactions, with hashtag Bell Let's Talk once again the top Twitter trend in Canada and worldwide. Though it would take some guessing and it would be far from accurate, we can do some basic math to find a ballpark number for interactions that were solely on Twitter. For example, if we split the total evenly 7 ways, we can see the result if each platform had equal numbers. This, of course, isn't accurate, so to be fairer, let's split that number in half to err on the side of caution. If we multiply this number with the low-end estimation of what it costs per tweet, adding the cost of $200,000 for a trending topic on Twitter, we arrive at $1,724,504.71 in tweets that put the name Bell in your head. All done without getting compensated by the company. This is just Twitter as well. If we were to run the same calculations for Instagram's cost per click or Facebook's cost per click, with click averages globally of 35 cents, we would arrive at a combined total of $1,677,000.95. Again, these numbers are on the low end and only an estimation. We don't know exactly how many posts were on each platform, what reach they got, or how much Bell spent on advertising before and after the day, but we do clearly see a return on investment here. At 5 cents per message, Bell is donating an additional $7,958,671.75 to mental health. Combining the lowest estimates of 3 out of 7 platforms in 2021 shows that the free advertising that Bell got from this is equal to about 42% of the donations towards mental health initiatives that they made that year. Now, this is without taking into account how much of the donations they made is tax deductible. I haven't been able to find a concrete answer on how much of the donations are tax deductible, but rest assured there is definitely a sizable chunk of money that would be given back to Bell by the government. And that's also assuming the numbers I have are correct, which, while they most certainly aren't, until Bell Canada releases the exact statistics for each platform, this is the lowest ballpark that we can generally assume. However, even if Bell donated more than what they made in free advertising and texts and calls, there would still be a structural issue to the campaign. To explain this, Vito uses an example from the tobacco industry. In the late 1990s, Philip Morris, a tobacco company, sponsored a cause marketing campaign to combat domestic violence. The company raised $60 million for the cause. However, consumers were unaware of the fact that Philip Morris spent an additional $100 million, $40 million more than it was giving away, to promote its own generosity. In regards to Bell Let's Talk, it would be interesting to discover how much Bell spends on advertisements on days leading up to the annual campaign. These numbers are currently unavailable to the public. Free advertising and more profits aren't all that Bell gains with the campaign, however. Premiers from Prince Edward Island, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the Canadian Armed Forces, even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have all lent their voices in support of the campaign. This may seem curious, as these people are directly responsible for healthcare funding in Canada. Some of them seem dead set on cutting taxes for corporations, which dries up some of the funding that they could use to fund these mental health services, even on the federal level. The message from the Canadian Armed Forces also rings hollow when compared to the horrific ongoing crisis of sexual assault in the military, which is undeniably bad for mental health. It should also be noted that there have been concerns raised in the past between Bell and the federal Liberal Party, which should probably not come as a surprise. I could only find 2 examples of governments matching donations by Bell and mental health. In 2017, a $300,000 donation to Fondation pour la Santé du Nord and Fondation Santé Sud de la Nordier matched by the Quebec government. In 2021, $2 million of Bell's donation went to Bell Let's Talk Brain Canada Mental Health Research Program, a cooperation of the 2 orgs that provides paradigm-changing brain research in Canada. This donation, according to a Bell Canada press release, was matched by Canada's federal government. This all culminates in credibility from institutions being lent to Bell, saying that Bell has some sort of authority over the topic of mental health and its stigma. Remember when I said that Bell denied counts of stress and overwork coming from their salespeople? The spokesperson's response denying these claims directly referenced this legitimacy. Bell has taken a leadership position in workplace mental health. It's part of the way we work at every level. That's been recognized by our team, the healthcare community, federal and other levels of government, other corporations across Canada, and internationally. The relationship between Bell and the governments of Canada continues. Do you remember when I brought up that Bell had exclusive contracts with provincial jails? Surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, provinces get kickbacks from that contract. They get a commission on every call made. Not that great for mental health, you have to admit. Beyond all this, we have to consider, if 4 out of 5 Canadians are now more willing to discuss mental health than when the campaign launched, does Bell Let's Talk work? Well, not really. First, we have to discuss the largest avenue in which Bell Let's Talk discusses mental health on, and that's social media. Let's face it, social media has a mental health problem. Facebook has known for a while that Instagram is incredibly damaging to mental health, specifically teen girls, and if you're even remotely online like I am on Twitter, you know that being a health site, it has been suggested that Twitter increases anxiety. So using these avenues to discuss mental health may be contradictory. Further to this, early studies show that accounts that did take part in Bell Let's Talk Day didn't dramatically change their behavior outside of that day. The findings suggest that users were not significantly more supportive of one another on the day of the event, though they appeared to self-disclose more on this date. While Bell appears to be doing a sufficient job at encouraging personal stories to be told and inviting users to share resources on how to alleviate their depression, this should not be taken at face value. The fact that Bell heavily profits off the campaign by incorporating their name into the hashtag, while hypocritically overlooking their mantras in unjust employee treatment, shows that there's much work to be done. In fact, there's reason to believe that people who take part in Bell Let's Talk Day are actually opening themselves up to predatory marketing practices. In that veto paper I cited earlier, she makes explicit reference to the fact that posting about mental health issues on these platforms informs the algorithm, and their data mining practices will show you ads that are supposed to help you treat your mental health. It is entirely possible that individuals who post their personal stories on Bell Let's Talk Day are targeted and exploited with advertisements for products that can assist with their mental health illnesses. Anti-anxiety blankets, antidepressant vitamins, and self-help books are just a few examples of goods that would so-called treat people who admit they are struggling. Ultimately, Bell Let's Talk Day can provide companies with data on who is mentally struggling and more likely to purchase goods and services for help. So let's return to the claim that 4 out of 5 Canadians are more aware of mental health issues since the campaign was launched. That's interestingly worded, isn't it? It doesn't directly tie the Canadian awareness of mental health issues to the campaign, it just says, since the campaign was launched. This isn't to say that Bell's campaign has absolutely no hand in increasing mental health awareness, simply to say that their own statistic doesn't directly tie their campaign to the increased awareness of mental health issues in Canada. It ultimately says nothing about what Bell directly did to impact mental health stigma in this country. I also couldn't find the statistic anywhere that wasn't cited from Bell, and Bell didn't have a study that I could link to, it just said it. It's also important to note that I have not talked about the work that these organizations are doing to destigmatize mental health, and if I were, I would not hand that achievement over to Bell. That's just disrespectful to the organizations and their workers. Bell Let's Talk is the simplest expression of corporate activism. It is delivered by a company that directly benefits from the system that causes and exacerbates these problems it attempts to address. These private entities and nonprofits outside of the public control are focusing on individualizing mental health and removing it from a systemic analysis. I also should point out that I don't just mean to lambast Bell with this. This is true of all corporations wading into the social justice sphere. However, pushing the onus of taking care of mental health onto private institutions who then push it onto the public to benefit from it themselves is a perfect example of why corporate activism fails on a fundamental level. For example, while donating money at a grocery store, taking part in a fun run, or yes, taking part in Bell Let's Talk Day, it individualizes these systemic issues to feel like we have power over what's going on. And while we may have a little bit of say, it really excludes the systemic causes of a lot of these problems. While a difference is surely being made, it gives us a sense of accomplishment while accomplishing on a systemic level very little. This framework has even bled into arguments that we should support more funding of mental health. The Conference Board of Canada reported in 2016 that lack of supports for people with depression and anxiety is costing Canada's economy $50 billion. Take note here that they're not reporting on families or individuals trying to access services or medication related to mental health. They're reporting on what it costs the economy by what it costs employers. This highlights the fact that there is a return on investment, he said. There is a gain for the employer in acting on mental health in the workplace. This may seem like an enticing argument to make on capitalists' own terms, but it reduces the problems of mental health down to profitability. The report stated that mental illness is preventing Canadians from working full-time or part-time jobs, and if these structures were built, we could see 325,000 Canadians enter the workforce by 2035 as fully functional employees. Not fully functional people. Fully functional employees, essentially reducing mental health down to concerns for profitability in Canadian industries. Beyond that, if we accept the framework of profitability in terms of mental health funding, then we cede the ground that it is a question of money, which means that the moment that it could be argued that it would be more profitable to strip funding of mental health services, that action will be taken much more swiftly than funding them. As somebody who struggles with his mental health, I take direct issue with Bell trying to take a monopoly on this topic. They're profiting off of misery, and they're directly harming the mental and physical health of Canadians. They pretend they're the ones giving to us, while they've been taking from us their entire existence. Bell wants to talk over us. We shouldn't let them. Hi everybody, if you enjoyed the video, hit like, hit subscribe, ring the bell. This took a long time to write and record. My camera died right as I started doing it. But yeah, leave a comment if this impacted you. Share it around. Don't let Bell dominate the conversation. You know, we have all got mental health problems going on right now, especially with the pandemic. And yeah, check out this thing I wrote on Passage too. Get a little bit more of a focus on the neoliberal aspect instead of the whole thing. And say goodbye to Wally. You know, you've been through a rough video, and I find that he always helps people feel a little bit better.